Okay, our second speaker is Dr. Hillel Ayala. Dr. Hillel Ayala has a PhD in history from the University of California, Los Angeles. Hillel is a leading member of the MDS department for many years. His courses deal with globalization, history, scientific thought, and changes in Israeli society. Within the global scope and approach, he researched Spanish migration to the New World in the 18th century. In his journey through social science history, he teaches with an inherently multidisciplinary outlook, combining history with economics, sociology, anthropology, and geography. As a member of the team, Hillel is responsible for the innovation and entrepreneurship cluster of the department and acts as a liaison to HIT's acceleration program, Future HIT. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Hillel Ayala. Good morning, Hillel.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the
good afternoon already. Okay.
Can I go?
Please.
Okay, thank you. 1 second. This is not moving. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the urban grid in colonial Spanish America, which means that we're going to have a little travel to history, and we're going to try to understand what does the urban grid tell us about society. We're going to look into two specific dimensions. One is social and racial inequality in urban history, and the other one is social integration and social mobility. So even though this talk is a talk in history and social history, I'll try to make it accessible to a non-specialist audience, and hopefully it will be clear enough. Okay. It's not working. Oops. Okay, a few words about colonial Spanish America. I'll try to do that quite briefly so we can get into the question of the grid. Let's begin with the conquest. The Spaniards conquer Spanish America, this area that we see here in red, in the early 16th century, following the Columbus and the Great Conquest. And after the major conquest, they establish a colonial society in which there is a racial and social hierarchy, meaning that at the top of society we have the Spaniards who rule and who dominate the economy, and at the bottom we have primarily Indians and later on also African slaves. So these two major groups form the lower classes of society. Now, within all this huge chunk of land, Spanish America, there is an important division between urban and rural society. Urban society is predominantly Spanish. It is Spanish in its culture, and it's also Spanish in its population, meaning that the cities of Spanish America that were established already in the 16th century are home to Spanish immigrants, the conquerors and their descendants, and also to their Spanish descendants in the New World, in Spanish America. In contrast to the urban areas, the rural society is predominantly indigenous, meaning it's mainly Indians. There's quite a great deal of separation between those two societies, and additionally, it is the urban world, the city, that controls economically and politically the countryside, that is the rural society. Now, I'm going to focus on the late colonial period, which is roughly the 18th century. So we're going to fast forward 200 years. If we stay for a second in the 16th century, we see that the major centers of the Spanish Empire were two. One is Mexico, the other is Peru. But if we move forward in time to the 18th century, there are new important centers because of their economic role in transatlantic commerce. They are joining Mexico and Peru. So places like Rio de la Plata, modern-day Argentina and Uruguay, Venezuela, Colombia, Chile, and and Cuba also become important economic and political centers of the Spanish Empire. Again, that is in the 18th century. That means that in all those places we have important cities, and in all those cities, what is really interesting is that the geographical structure is a grid. Now let's talk a little bit about urban society, and then move on to see a few things focusing on Mexico City, Caracas, and Buenos Aires. In the urban society, that is in cities such as Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Lima, anywhere, we have a great degree of interracial contact. That's where the Indians and Spaniards come together. Of course, that's where also the racial hierarchy is most visible, because they live together, and that's where inequality between racial groups is emphasized. It is much more greatly experienced. Now, we can see that in the residential pattern in the city, in the grid. The center was predominantly Spanish, while the periphery, that is the outskirts of the city, was mainly indigenous. Now here we have a very general division of society into racial groups. So on top we have the Spaniards. Again, that includes Spanish immigrants and their descendants, those born in Spanish America. At the bottom we have the Indians, and in between we have what is called castas. Those are racially mixed people. So very generally speaking, they occupy an in-between group in the city. So let's take a look at some of the cities of colonial Spanish America. We're going to start with Buenos Aires. We can see the grid structure of Buenos Aires in the 18th century. Once again, it's a city that emerged largely in the 18th century. It was established before, but it's only in the 18th century that it becomes a sizable city and an important economic center. Caracas, same thing, also emerges in the 18th century, mostly in the second half of the 18th century, and it also has this grid structure. In both those cities, the economic importance, as anywhere else, is based on exports of goods. Bogota, once again, we see the grid. Guatemala is a relatively old center. It's a city that was established and was quite lively already in the 16th century, as much as Mexico City, but it was relatively marginal. It was not as important, and therefore it was much smaller. So that's for Guatemala City. And here's Havana. Again, it also becomes an important center in the 18th century because of African slavery. That African slaves are brought to work in the sugar plantations of Cuba. Anywhere in any city, you see the grid. And finally, Lima. Lima is one of the older centers, again, an important city already in the 16th century, together with Mexico City. And that's because it's a major exporter of silver. So, as you can see, we have the grid everywhere. That and let's talk about the residential pattern and what we can learn from it about society. When we look at urban residential patterns where people live within the city, we can see that there's a great degree of divergence pretty much anywhere across race, class, and occupation. The center is usually occupied by the wealthy and powerful families, which are largely Spanish. They form the upper classes, and they hold the most wealthy occupations and families, mainly commerce. Again, in the outskirts of the city, we see a non-Spanish population, mostly indigenous or racially mixed population. We can also use the residential patterns of the city to examine the regional origins of Spanish immigrants throughout the period in the 18th century and already since the 16th century. Immigrants keep coming from Spain. On the whole, immigrants from Spain occupy the upper echelons of society. Yeah. Not all of them, but largely they belong to the elite. And the other thing is that we can see that residence in the city also reflects socioeconomic inequality, which we will get to in a second. The sources I use to provide data on those social patterns are two. One is censuses, especially for Mexico City. The other is marriage records. The advantage of censuses in general is that usually, when they're complete, they provide exact location, so we can map a lot of people in the exact location on the map. And marriage records from the church archives throughout Spanish America or elsewhere in the world are also useful because they have the advantage that we can notice change over time. Okay, here's an example of a page from the census of Mexico City, on which I'm going to focus now. And here are several examples of marriage records from different places in Spanish America. Now let's talk about Mexico City. Mexico City was the largest city in the New World, in the Americas, up until 1800 and beyond. It was home to about 170,000 people, by far the largest city in the world, and certainly the most most important economic center of the Spanish Empire. And therefore, it was also a place where Indians and Spaniards met. Here's another map of the grid of Mexico City in the late 18th century. Now, if we take this subdivision of Mexico City into neighborhoods, we can do a lot of things to understand society. Here we have marked is the center, and the red spot is the cathedral, which is the epicenter of the entire city. Now, if we examine where people live across the city through the census, let's take a look at this chart. I divided the city into neighborhoods of the center, semi-periphery, somewhere in between, and periphery. That's the outskirts of the city. You can see that in the neighborhoods of the center, there's a great percent of Spaniards, much more than in the semi-periphery and in the periphery. So the further we move to the periphery of the city, Mexico City, we see a greater percentage of Indians, which is the gray part of the column, and castas, racially mixed people. That's a very interesting feature that shows us the divergence or inequality within the city. Just to make sure that there was indeed a difference between the center and the outskirts, here we see in this scatter plot the different neighborhoods of Mexico City, where each neighborhood is plotted in terms of the share of Spaniards living in the neighborhood across the average rent. The price of real estate in each neighborhood, which I was able to get from a different source. And we can see that there's a great correlation between each neighborhood and the percentage of Spaniards living in it. In neighborhoods like those, which are the center, where we have a large percentage of Spaniards, we also see that they are quite expensive, and vice versa. Those are the neighborhoods with a majority of Indians. So here we see on this map the division of Mexico City into center, semi-periphery, and periphery, following the data that I've just presented. So, by the way, the missing ones are just not available in the census. This is not moving. Oh, okay, so here we can see two imaginary circles that allow us to see the city split into center, semi-periphery, and periphery. And as we've noticed, there's a great difference between those areas of the city. Okay, let's move on. We can also divide Mexico City into parishes, those local churches within the city, and this way also study center and periphery within the grid. By looking at the marriage records, we can see the development across the 18th century of racial intermarriage. This is important because it allows us to see how interaction, at least in terms of marriage, developed across the 18th century and where that interaction took place. So in the this orange line, we can see the peripheral parishes of Mexico City. We can see an increasing degree of intermarriage between different races. Whereas in the center, which is the parish of the cathedral, plotted here, we see kind of a decline in racial intermarriage. This has important consequences for different issues in Spanish American history for the late colonial period and the early national period, into which I'm not going to get at this presentation. Let's move on and say a few things about Buenos Aires. Here's that map again. This is at the bottom is the ocean. And when we look at Buenos Aires and try to divide it into parishes, it doesn't really work because of the structure of the parishes. So we're just going to do with a general division between the center and which is the parish of the cathedral, and all the other parishes, which we will define as periphery. We can see in Buenos Aires also a great degree of divergence in terms of race. The peripheral parishes consisted of a much greater percentage of non-Spanish persons, also African slaves and free Africans and mestizos, different kinds of racially mixed people, but anyway, less Spaniards. Spaniards concentrated here in the center to a much greater degree. The same goes for Caracas. If we divide the city of Caracas into parishes, we also see that the center around the cathedral consisted of a much greater share of Spanish population. The periphery was made up of blacks, Indians, mestizos, and other ones. Okay, now let's move on to talk about something slightly different, which is Spanish immigrants. We know about Spanish immigrants that they form a very small percentage of the population in Spanish America, meaning that they were between 5 to 10% of the population within the city. But anyway, they are mostly integrated into the urban elite. They are integrated into commercial networks. Many of them, not many of them, but some of them become extremely wealthy as merchants and other businessmen, but not all. Anyway, they come from different ethnic regions in Spain. And here I'm going to focus on 3 regions. One is the Basque provinces, Basques. The other one is Galicia in the northwest of Spain. And the third is Andalusia in southern Spain. We can also see that within the community of Spanish immigrants, once again, it's a small part of society, but still an important one. Within that community, there is a great disparity depending on the origins of migrants. Let's see what we can say about that. Here we see the percentage of Spanish immigrants residing in the urban center of each of 3 cities, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and Caracas. That is in the 18th century. And this is collected from, once again, marriage records. It should be noted that we're talking about male immigrants only, because male immigrants formed 90% of the entire flow from Spain to Spanish America. Anyway, we see here something quite interesting. In the blue columns, bars, we see the Basques. So on the whole, we see that the Basques were tended to concentrate in the center much more than the other groups. The two other groups, that is Galicians and Andalusians, also resided to some degree in the peripheral neighborhoods or parishes of each of these cities. So once again, we see a difference between the three ethnic regional groups of migrants from Spain, but also note that we see a difference between Mexico City, in which, on the whole, Spanish immigrants tended to reside in the center, compared to Buenos Aires and Caracas. What does that tell us? Well, quite a few things, but one important thing is that in Buenos Aires and in Caracas, Spanish immigrants were not as concentrated in the center as in Mexico City. That means that there was, on the whole, a difference in the social structure between Mexico City compared to Buenos Aires and Caracas. In the long term, that would mean that Buenos Aires and Caracas would indeed develop on a relatively more egalitarian basis. Egalitarian might be too much for that, but once again, compared to Mexico City, we see in the long run, into the modern period, a greater equality within society in cities like Buenos Aires and Caracas. And in some way, it is showed in this chart, which means that a great share of migrants also resided in the periphery of the city. Those are the parts missing here, right? While in Mexico City, the Spanish elite was much more entrenched and occupied in the center. So here we see this chart again, Mexico City on the left-hand side, and here's Buenos Aires and Caracas, and we get the idea that in these two cities, once again, which emerged in the 18th century, we have a greater dispersion of Spanish immigrants. We have much more migrants in the periphery of the city of Caracas and of Buenos Aires, while in Mexico City they are much more concentrated in the center. Okay. A few conclusions. I hope that was not too dense, but anyway, I want to say a few things about colonial Spanish America that we may have seen in the data that I presented here. First of all, racial inequality across urban zones of the region could be seen once again everywhere in every city, and it could be seen using the grid. Once again, the distinction we've seen between center and periphery of the city. At the same time, we see greater integration by the 18th century. This is, we can detect that in the data we have seen for Mexico City, and also in the data on Spanish migrants, at least in the emerging centers of Caracas and Buenos Aires, where there's a greater dispersion of Spanish migrants throughout the city. And last thing, we may also argue that social mobility and also social integration are reflected by residents and are correlated also with race? This is a very big question, and it is perhaps somewhat controversial, but anyway, I will not get into that further than that. Beyond the field of colonial Spanish America, we can draw a few methodological conclusions. First of all, we can see that the analysis of urban space, if we break down a city into neighborhoods or parishes, that could be quite useful for the study of social questions, issues like social interaction between different groups. Here we've talked about mainly about racial groups, integration, once again, of social groups, or social mobility. Those are things that could be studied using the analysis of urban space, of the grid. The second conclusion, following the first one, is that the urban grid structure helps to overcome, at least when we are talking about history, problems like data scarcity, which is quite common in history. But in any case, it also makes possible to examine historical questions, mainly in urban history, using the grid structure as the basis for analysis. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Eyal, for your inspiring talk. If I may, I have one question for you. In your lecture, you talked about migration of population into the big cities. Nowadays, we experience an opposite movement from the cities outside. What do you make of this trend?
Yes, it's interesting to note that in those times, certainly in colonial Spanish America, but also in other regions, the center was still the place where rich, wealthy, powerful families resided. Whereas in modern times, especially I believe since the second half of the 20th century, there's been a movement to the suburbs, if I understand the question correctly. So yes, that's different theories that explain those contrasting trends. But in any case, with the data that I showed, and we have also lots of sources, we do know that back then, the center of the city was still also the center of power and wealth. And yes, indeed, today that's not really the case. It also depends where, and even today we see actually opposite trends. Also many urban zones throughout the world. I could think of Tel Aviv, for example, the movement back to the center. This could be a result of different economic and political factors, which is beyond my topic. But anyway, once we established the fact that back then the center was home to the powerful people, powerful families, and in Spanish America it's to people of Spanish descent, we can also understand other issues about society.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed for joining us, and it was our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.